Well, hopefully, I only have a few things to say about Jean-Paul Sartre's Existentialism and Humanism, written in 1946, right after World War II. Uh, I chose this essay to end the sequence of readings in political philosophy from Hobbes through Locke to Rousseau, because I thought it was a particularly modern and fitting culmination of those political writings. I think that what Sartre's doing here is, in a certain way, overturning or attempting to overturn everything that those writers were doing. Um, Existentialism is humanism. Well, there are two terms there, and I suppose both of them need to be defined to some extent if we're going to figure out what Sartre is doing in this essay. What is existentialism? It is something that we've heard about, probably. But and perhaps in vague ways. And one of the things that Sartre is trying to do here is to get more definite and concrete in talking about what he takes existentialism as a philosophy to be. And that is right here, talking about different kinds of existentialists, Christian existentialists, atheist existentialists. He says what they have in common is simply the fact that they believe that existence comes before essence. And that is the great motto of existentialism, that existence comes before essence, or existence precedes essence. And he tells you exactly what he means. It's not really all that difficult to understand. He gives an example of a paper knife. That may not be the best example for us, since we don't use paper knives anymore. A paper knife is not a knife made out of paper. A paper knife is a knife for cutting paper. Books used to come with some of their pages attached to each other, and you had to cut them apart, and they had special knives for it. So it's just an ordinary object they would have had at hand. And he just uses as an example of any tool that's made with a paper knife or a hammer or a lamp or a pencil. It doesn't matter. Um, Essence precedes existence. That is, essence is the idea of the thing, how it is to be made, what function it is supposed to serve, what it's supposed to do. And the idea is that the person who makes the tool has the idea or the essence of the thing in their minds, and then produces the thing, makes it exist, but in accord with that idea or essence. So for something, an ordinary object like a clock or a book or a phone or a pen, just looking around my table, clearly essence precedes, comes before existence. But his whole point here is that that is not true of human beings. For human beings, it's the other way around. Existence comes before essence, or existence precedes essence. That is, we first exist, and without any defining essence, without any idea of what we as human beings are for or are supposed to do, or how we are supposed to live, we simply exist first. And then, as he says, we make up our essence afterwards through our actions. That is the great overturning that Sartre is, I think, doing in this essay, is that there is no such thing, as he says, as human nature. This is here, he says, yeah, he mentions human nature, and then he says, basically, we don't have one. Right? Right. He talks about Kant and previous philosophers who assume that human beings have a nature. That nature would be their essence, or what is most definitive about them, or something they're born with in terms of a structure of their being that they're supposed to follow in some way or another. And Sartre thinks that's all over, especially if we reject God. That is, as he says here, atheistic existentialism, of which I am a representative, declares with greater consistency that if God does not exist, there is at least one being whose existence comes before its essence, a being which exists before it can be defined by any conception of it. That being is man, or human beings. As a result, there is no such thing as human nature. We're not born. Human nature would be that sort of nature or structure or general shape, you might say, that we are born with. And Sartre is saying there is no such thing. And it follows immediately for him from his atheism. Thus, he says, there is no human nature because there is no God to have a conception of it. Man simply is. We just exist. So none of us are born with a nature. Human beings are those creatures that have no nature. They just exist. But it goes on to say, not that he is simply what he conceives himself to be, but he is what he wills. That is, what we will and what we do, what we choose, really shapes our nature. She gives us an essence. But he is what he wills, and as he conceives himself after already existing, as he wills to be after that leap towards existence, man is nothing else but that which he makes of himself. This is the first principle of existentialism. So, if we can be said to have an essence, and maybe it doesn't even make any sense to say we have an essence after we've reconceived this thing, but if we can be said to have an essence, it is an essence that we create for ourselves through not sort of just by, as he says, we're not necessarily what we conceive ourselves to be. We can be wrong about that. That is, we can be wrong in our conceptions of who we really are, because who we really are is a matter of our will and our choices rather than our wishes, let's say, for ourselves. So we will define ourselves as human beings through our acts. And is that will and choice, which is what's most important, because that is what defines us. To the point where he almost, in a certain way, I would say, I don't know if this is a contradiction. I know I'm looking up the word freedom a lot. There's 24 uses the word freedom here, so you can figure that's pretty important. But he's talking about here the idea of abandonment. He has these different ideas of what our fundamental human condition is. He mentions anguish, abandonment, and despair. Anguish is the idea that we have no guidance in life, right? That is, once we give up the idea that there are pre-existing values that define our nature and that could guide our nature, we're left to our own devices. We find that we have to choose, but we have no guide except our own, well, I don't know. There are no pre-existing values to guide us. And that results in what he calls anguish. And then when talking about abandonment is basically being abandoned by God. I mean, that is, if there is no God, there is no authority that could tell us how to live, and so we have to figure it out for ourselves. But what does that mean? Well, we have to figure it out with no guidance at all. And that leads him again here, where he says, for if indeed existence precedes essence, one will never be able to explain one's actions by reference to a given and specific human nature. In other words, there is no determinism. Man is free. Man is freedom. So in a certain way, you might say we do have an essence, and that essence is that we are free. And that's incredibly important when to start thinking, because although he doesn't try to rebuild any sort of values or any sort of guidance, the kind of thing that he says is lost when we no longer believe in God. I mean, he doesn't believe in God. I mean, God doesn't obviously not exist, but Sartre has certainly left any sort of religious view of the universe behind. Um, but he doesn't try to rebuild any kind of values once that's gone. Basically, what he says is that all we have really to define us is our freedom. So, what does that mean? Well, I mean that as uh, Dostoevsky, he quotes Dostoevsky. He actually misquotes Dostoevsky. But he says Dostoevsky once wrote, "If God did not exist, everything would be permitted," and that, for existentialism, is the starting point. That is, everything is permitted, right? As he says, everything is indeed permitted if God does not exist. But there are no rules. There's no morality that we can, in terms of principles that everyone should follow, that would determine right and wrong and how to live the right sort of human life. It doesn't exist for Sartre. But that doesn't mean that there is no, I mean, there may be no right and wrong that we can really gather. But what we can say is that if human beings are freedom, then we need to be willing to accept that. As he says, it's not necessarily a nice thing. That's why he says, we are left alone, he says, without excuse. That is what I mean when I say that man is condemned to be free. That freedom is not necessarily a comfortable position for us because maybe we're not so happy about being free. And he gives us a reason for that. And that is the last sort of, I would say, big idea here is responsibility. That is, in the absence of God, in the absence of any sort of pre-existing values or pre-existing nature, we are condemned to be free, and so must, because if we recognize our freedom, we are called upon to take entire responsibility for what we are. And that, I think, is the last word. That is, there are not, I would say, in the way that Sartre is conceiving of things, there are not no right and wrong actions. There are no good and bad actions. There are actions in which the human being takes responsibility, and there are actions in which they don't. There are actions in which human beings realize and acknowledge that they are free creatures and so take responsibility for their actions. And there are actions in which people deny their freedom and try to slough off that responsibility. They aren't necessarily bad. The usual way of thinking of it, I don't even remember if it's in the, yeah, is doing things in good faith. That's really the response. That's the sort of substitute for good and bad. That is, if we do something and we realize our freedom in choosing that thing, and we're willing to bear all the responsibility for that choice, then we've acted in good faith. That's the best we can say. Whereas if we do something and we do not acknowledge our freedom, we try to blame the action or the choice on some other determining factor outside of ourselves, then that is bad faith. And that is a denial of our, essentially, of our human condition, which is the condition of freedom.